Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and in this episode of Legacy Logbook, I'll be covering the dual-colored lands. There's quite a few of them since they've been around all the way back in Alpha, just like the basics were, and although they haven't been in as many sets as the basics, they've been in a lot, and I've had a ton of variations over the years. And as a final note before I get into it, I'll just let you know that I'm not going to be reading out every single name of every land in this video. This is already going to be a really long video without that, but every card will be on screen, so you can just pause if you want to read all the card names. The obvious starting point is the very beginning with the True Duels in Alpha. The True Duels are some of the most brokenly good lands ever printed, or at least the most brokenly good dual colors ever printed. They can make either color of mana, have both basic land types, and come in untapped. They basically just function like two basics at the same time, just as fast, just as interactable, but with more options, making them just better than basics with no drawbacks at all other than, I guess, kind of the limit you can have in your deck. Clearly, these were not very balanced, to the point where there was a design rule implemented that going forward, no land could be strictly better than basic lands. This rule has been a bit relaxed since then, but most dual lands still have some sort of extra cost or drawback, the first of which came several sets later in Ice Age in 95, with two cycles of allied colored dual lands, the Pain Lands and Depletion Lands. Although, real quick, before I explain these lands, I should talk about the allied versus enemy colors, since these will come up a lot. I'm sure most of you watching already know, but for those of you who don't, the allied and enemy colors refer to the 10 different color combos that are possible. Basically, every color has its own themes and strengths and a bit of personality that gets along better with some colors and worse with others. And the connection is the allied colors are the pairs that are adjacent to each other, which is white-blue, blue-black, black-red, red-green, and green-white. And the enemy colors are the non-adjacent pairs, which is white-black, blue-red, black-green, red-white, and green-blue. These sets of color combos are what I'm referring to every time I say allied or enemy colored lands. And now back to the Ice Age lands. Starting with the Pain lands, these lands can tap for a colorless for free, or can tap for either of their colored mana at the cost of a life every time you tap it. These were much more balanced than the True Duels, having both a safe option for weaker mana or a riskier option for colored mana, but still giving the benefit of the choice of that mana. These were so well balanced, in fact, that they've received a lot of reprints throughout the years, commonly seen in commander sets even to this day. The depletion lands, on the other hand, were not quite as good. These lands instead just tap for either of their colors, and when tapped gain a depletion counter, but during upkeep, if it has any depletion counters, it removes a counter instead of untapping. This means that these lands can only be used once every 2 turns, or potentially even less often if your opponent can increase your counters with something like Proliferate. The depletion lands were later reworked to a slightly better way of doing the same effect, which I will get to later, and thus these were only ever printed the one time. Next up is Mirage in 1996 with the Fetch lands, or more specifically the Tap Fetch lands. These are a cycle of allied colored lands that come in tapped and then can sacrifice itself to search for either of its basic land types and put them in play. These have been reprinted a couple times, but have effectively been made obsolete by the, more regular fetch lands that we see today. And in 1997, we get the previously mentioned reworked depletion lands in the set Tempest. These ones are known as the Nap lands, and they can tap for a colorless, or tap for either of their colors, and if tapped for colored mana, they don't untap on their next untap phase. They get the additional colorless mana option and simply don't untap instead of having a counter added, so effectively the same function that they were going for, but without the potential drawback of counters being increased. But even though they're better than those original depletion lands, the Nap lands still aren't good, and have not really received reprints or even enemy-colored versions. But speaking of enemy colors, Tempest also introduced enemy-colored Pain lands, although they do come in tapped as opposed to the original Ice Age Pain lands, so I guess these are tap Pain lands. and there was no new dual colors for a whole 3 years after that. Finally seeing new ones in Invasion in 2000, these are the allied colored pure tap lands. And these are dual colors that just come in tapped. Nothing more, nothing less. There are lots of lands that come in tapped, and those are called tap lands, but these are pure tap lands because that's their literal only thing. The following year in Apocalypse, we got the regular enemy colored pain lands. These of course are exactly the same as the pain lands in Ice Age, just, the enemy colors. But don't worry, 2001 did also add something entirely new. Odyssey introduced the allied colored filter lands. These are lands that, at the cost of 1 mana, tap to produce both of their colors. This is the first time a dual color can make both instead of just choosing one, and since it costs 1, you still only get a net gain of 1 total mana, but if you use, the colorless mana, it can get you a net gain of 2 colored mana. And the very next set, Torment, brought more dual colors, but this time it was a very weird group. As opposed to every other group so far, which has been allied colors, enemy colors, or both, this is only 4 cards, and it's just the black combos. These are known as the Tainted lands, since they all have tainted in their names, and these are the first versions of Czech lands, but are a bit different from other Czech lands, but we'll get to those later. These lands can tap for a colorless or tap for either of their colors only if you control a swamp. Even weirder still, the following set, Judgment, introduced a very unique fetch land, Croson Verge. The other fetch lands sacrifice to search for a corresponding basic, but Croson Verge sacrifices to get both a forest and a plains. Additionally, it can tap for a colorless, unlike the traditional dual color fetch lands, but does come in tapped like the previous Mirage fetch lands did. And although there is one other double fetch land, which is Blighted Woodland, which can get 2 of any basic, Croson Verge is the only dual color that is a double fetch land. But fetch lands would change in the very next set, Onslaught. This set redid the allied colored fetch lands to now come in untapped and have an additional cost of 1 life to activate the effect. This trade-off of 1 life for a faster activation made these the go-to dual-colored fetch lands for, well, basically always. These still see huge amounts of play in every format that allows them. The streak does end there, though, because the next set does not have any dual colors, or land at all for that matter, and a new dual color was not printed until Champions of Kamigawa in 2004. But all we got was the Naplands again, and not even enemy-colored Naplands, just the allied-colored Naplands with new names. These are not technically reprints because of the new names, but the effects are reprints. So we don't get any new dual colors until Ravnica, which drops 2 sets of 4 lands with seemingly no particular pattern of colors, other than both sets have the same. To start, it introduced the Shock lands, some of the best and most used dual colors ever. These have the basic land types, and come in tapped unless you pay 2 life. So these are kinda just the same as the true duels, just as searchable, just as interactable, but with the cost of 2 life to be just as fast, which is not really an issue at all. It's not hard to see why these are a top tier dual color land that are played in every format that allows them. And Ravnica's other dual colors aren't quite so top tier. These are the bounce lands. The bounce lands are lands that come in tapped, return a land to your hand when played, and then tap for both colors. This definitely isn't a bad effect, but returning the land to your hand in order to get the 2 kind of is the balance out, but after a turn or 2, you do start getting more mana out of it, because you're making 2 mana per turn. The following set, Guild Pact, printed more of both Shocklands and the Bounce lands. Not really much else to say, it's just kind of filling out the sets. And then the next one, Dissension, finished off those 2 sets of dual colors, so we have all 10 color combos of both. But the set after all those Ravnica sets, Cold Snap, introduced something entirely new. Well, maybe not entirely new. Cold Snap prints allied colored snow pure tap lands. So just pure tap lands, but with the snow super type, which is slightly better than the previous pure tap lands because, the snow makes them a little bit more interactable and makes them able to make snow mana, but the effect is still just pure tap lands. And for the 5th set in a row, we get new dual colors, with Time Spiral introducing the storage lands. These can tap for a colorless, or can pay a generic and tap to add a storage counter. And then while it has storage counters on it, you can pay a generic and remove the storage counters to make mana in any combination of its two colors equal to the number of counters removed. These are pretty terrible. Basically just a mana loss to color fix. Like, you have to pay a mana to make a storage counter, and then you have to pay another mana to remove a storage counter. So, at minimum, you have to take a loss of 1 mana every time. And it takes a while to build up those storage counters. So yeah, you're just color fixing, but losing mana in the process. The next set with dual colors, Future Sight, is an odd one, with 5 lands that are all very unique, and the first set to have dual colored lands that actually don't match each other. They're not a cycle. And so I'm gonna have to cover like each one individually. First off, we've got River of Tears, which is dimmer colored and taps for a blue if you haven't played a land yet this turn, or black if you have. This is one of the most unique effects, and I guess makes it some sort of check land, but I'm not entirely sure what to call this one. Nimbus Maze is Azorius colored and is more traditional check land, but in reverse. It can tap for a colorless, or tap for a white if you control an island, or blue if you control a plains. So the colored mana it makes is checking for the opposite color of basic. Horizon Canopy is Selesnya colored, and is a pain land costing a life to tap for its colors, or it also has cycling, so you can pay a generic and tap and sack to draw a card. Grove of the Burn Willows is Gruul colored, and is an enemy's boon land, which is basically a reverse pain land. Instead of costing a life to tap for its colored mana, it gives all opponents 1 life to tap for its colored mana, or you can just tap for a colorless for free. Graven Cairns is a Rakdos colored filter land that can tap for a colorless, or for a red-black mana, it can tap to make 2 mana in any combination of red and black. The next set with dual colors came a couple sets later in Lorwyn. Lorwyn has some interesting check lands, or I guess they're not really check lands, they're reveal lands, because instead of checking for corresponding basic or basic types like most check lands do, these instead have you reveal a corresponding creature type from your hand, and then have the land come in tapped if you revealed that creature. Also, even though there's 5 lands, which would normally be a cycle, these are a mix of allied and enemy colored lands, so it's not a cycle. Then, a couple of sets later in Shadowmoor, Graven Cairns was reprinted along with the rest of its cycle of allied colored filter lands being added, with the enemy colored cycle dropping in the next set Eventide. And now we get to the allied colored traditional check lands in Magic 2010. These lands enter tapped unless you already control either corresponding basic land type, and tap for either of their colors. This is the type of check land that most players will be familiar with, and is the one that gets reprinted the most often. And speaking of familiar lands, the next setup is Zendikar, bringing in some pretty iconic lands. Zendikar finally adds the enemy-colored fetch lands, and adds a new cycle of allied-colored lands called the Refuge lands, that come in tapped and give you a life when played, and of course, can tap for either of their colors. And the following set, Worldwake, adds another cycle of allied colored lands, this time in the form of tapped man lands. Tap being that they come in tapped, and man being that they transform into creatures. All of them have different costs, different stats, and different abilities while a creature, but they do all share that they transform for only a turn and then transform back, and of course stay being a land while transformed, and thus can still tap for either color even while they're being transformed into a creature. After another couple of sets with nothing new, we get to Scars of Mirrodin, which introduced the allied colored fast lands. These lands come in tapped unless you control 2 or less other lands, and then just have a standard tap for either color, but these were meta-level dual colors at the time, and still see high-level play in formats that allow them, like Commander and Modern, being great opening hand cards to get your options going early, or even a decent failsafe for board wipes to get you back up to speed sooner. The next dual colors are another set of familiar lands, the enemy-colored checklands from Innistrad. These are just the same as the 2010 checklands, just, the enemy colors. And then we've got several sets with nothing again, until Return to Ravnica, when we get the allied-colored Guild Gates. Guild Gates are just pure tap lands functionally, but they have the gate subtype, so they're a little more interactable. And the wait for the rest of the Guild Gates was very short, being added in the following set, Gatecrash. And although not new, I thought I'd mention that the third set in the block, Dragon's Maze, reprinted all 10 Guild Gates in one set. Following that, the next set, Theros, introduces the Scry lands, aka the Temples. You scry one when you play them, and otherwise they're just typical, tap duels. And this is another odd instance of a set having mixed allied and enemy colors. The rest of the block finished adding in the rest of the temples, 3 more in Born of the Gods, and the final 2 in Journeyed into Nyx. With a gap set in between, Khans of Tarkir was the next set with dual colors. A lot of dual colors, actually. Most of which were reprints, though, but it does add a new cycle of all 10 colors called the Gain lands. These have the exact same effect as the Refuge lands, but it's all 10 colors, and the allied ones get new names. Then, in Battle for Zendikar, we get some really interesting dual colors. A cycle of allied colored check lands called the Battle lands. They check for basics instead of basic types, and they enter tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. But in addition, these lands have basic land types themselves, giving them that extra interaction that comes with it. This set also adds 2 man lands that come in tapped and transform into elementals. These are in Simic and Orzhov colors. The following set in the same block, Oath of the Gatewatch, adds more pure tap lands in allied colors. Not sure why they thought we needed more allied pure tap lands instead of just reprinting the ones that already existed, but we got them. And it also continues the man lands from the previous set, finishing off the enemy colors. And the streak continues with the following set, Shadows over Innistrad, with a cycle of allied colors and enemy colors, but not of the same thing. First off is the Reveal lands. These are similar to check lands, but instead of checking if you control the corresponding basics, you reveal a corresponding basic from your hand, just like those other ones that revealed the creature types. And the enemy-colored lands are more pure tap lands, but enemy-colored this time, so that's new. Then skipping a set up to Kaladesh, we get the enemy-colored Fastlands. It's been 6 years since we got the allied-colored Fastlands, but we finally got the enemy ones. And then we skip another set up to Amonkhet, where we get the Bicycle lands, which are allied-colored cycling lands. These are lands with basic land types and come in tapped with the Cycling 2 ability. And then there's only reprints until Battle Bond introduces the Bond lands. These are a type of check land, but the thing they're checking is the number of opponents. The Bond lands come in tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents. This set was made for the two-headed giant format, but these lands see much more play in Commander since that's the most common multiplayer format. Following this is a whole block of sets with nothing but reprints, up until Modern Horizons brings in a new take on Pain lands, called the Horizon lands. And you might think they're named after the set they're from, which was the case for the Bond lands a set ago, but these are actually named for their original card with their abilities, Horizon Canopy from Future Sight. Yeah, remember that weird set? But unlike Graven Cairns, which got reprinted with the rest of its cycle, Horizon Canopy is nowhere to be seen, and we get the enemy-colored cycle instead. And the rest of the allied colors still haven't been printed, meaning that there's a very strange total of 6 Horizon lands. And then we get the enemy-colored Bond lands in Commander Legends. This is the first time a Commander set has introduced new dual colors, but otherwise it's just, the Bond lands, but enemy. Next up is Kaldheim introducing the Snow Duels. These are functionally pure tap lands, but with the Snow super type. And you might be thinking, hey, didn't we already see that in Cold Snap? Well, almost, because unlike the ones in Cold Snap, these ones have basic land types, and it also introduces all 10 color combos. In the following set, Strixhaven, School of Mages, we get 2 different enemy-colored cycles, the Snarls and the Campuses. The Snarls are just enemy-colored reveal lands, but they all have Snarl in the name, so they're generally referred to as that. And then the Campuses are similarly named, but are functionally new. coming in tapped and having an ability to pay 4 mana and tap to scry 1. This is a very rare instance of enemy colors being printed first, although, spoiler alert, the allied colored campuses have yet to be printed. Moving on to Modern Horizons 2, we get to the bridges. These are a full set of all 10 duels that come in tapped, are indestructible, and are also artifacts. Otherwise, they're kinda just pure tap lands. And then we get to some top tier dual colors in Innistrad Midnight Hunt, the allied colored slow lands. These lands come in tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands, which is the opposite of the fast lands, but funnily enough, both are still top tier in their formats. The enemy colors were added in the following set: Innistrad Crimson Vow. Not really much more to say on that, it's just the enemy colors of the same thing. But they can't all be winners, as evidenced by the next dual colors out of Streets of New Capenna. These are the allied colored sack draw lands, which is basically just cycling but without the keyword. They come in tapped, can tap for either of their colors, and at the cost of 2 generic and 1 mana each of both of their corresponding colors, so 4 mana total, tap and sack to draw a card. This cost is just way too much for a single draw, and without that, they're just kind of pure tap lands, so these aren't really used much. But speaking of pure tap lands, the next new dual colors are a set of all 10 pure tap lands in Dominaria United. Except they're technically not pure, because they're different, just like the Snowlands from Kaldheim and Cold Snap, or like the Guild Gates. Functionally, they're just pure tap lands, but they have basic land types, so they're technically distinguished as the land type tap lands. And the following set, the Brothers' War, introduces one dual colored land, Fortified Beachhead. This is an Azurus colored check reveal land that comes in tapped unless you control a soldier or reveal a soldier from your hand. Then it can tap for either of its colors, or for 5 generic and a tap, give all of your soldiers plus 1/1 until end of turn. This is definitely one of the weirdest dual colored lands, especially since it's coming in by itself, but isn't great. The next dual color is a standalone one too, coming from Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth set. It's Mount Doom, and this one is a bit better. This is currently the one and only legendary dual colored land, and is Rakdos colored. Its mana ability is the same as a Pain land, pay a life and tap for either of its colors, but it also has a couple more abilities. It can pay a generic, a red, and a black to tap and deal 1 damage to all opponents. And finally, for 5 generic, a red and a black, you can tap and sacrifice Mount Doom and a legendary artifact you control, then destroy all creatures except 2 that you choose. So, basically a board wipe. Moving on, we next see dual colors in Wilds of Eldraine in the form of enemy-colored Restless Lands. These are man lands that come in tapped and have an ability that triggers when they attack, but otherwise all have different transformation costs, stats, and the effect themselves are different. But they also all have Restless in the name, which is why they're called the Restless Lands. And the allied colored Restless Lands came soon after in Caverns Below Ixalan. These also have different stats and abilities, but functionally work the same as the other Restless Lands. The next set, Murders at Karlov Manor, had a set of all 10 colors, and really good ones at that. These are the Surveil lands. They come in tapped, but Surveil 1 when played, and have the added bonus of having basic land types. As of the making of this video, these are current competitive meta level lands, and the extra interactability from having basic land types and the utility of a free surveil makes it no wonder how these would see high level play. And in the same set, but also kind of not, because it's a special box, Ravnica Clue Edition, we get even more dual colors in the form of the Clue Runes. These are lands that all come in tapped and have the same ability to pay 4 mana and tap to investigate. The next new duels are also from a Universes Beyond set, Fallout, but there's not a lot to say. These are just the enemy-colored filter lands from all the way back in Odyssey. Kinda crazy that it took 23 years for them to print the new enemy-colored filter lands, but they finally did it. Next up is Outlaws of Thunder Junction, introducing the Ping lands. These are a set of all 10 colored lands, with the subtype of desert, and they come in tapped and deal 1 damage to a target player when played. Also sometimes referred to by other names like Crime Deserts to include the desert part of them. The next dual colors are a little bit weird. They're flip lands in Modern Horizons 3, and these are lands on the back of like spell cards, so when the card is played you can either play the spell on the front or the land on the back, but not both. And when you play the land, they're kind of just pure tap lands. There's all 10 of these, and yeah, they're just pure tap lands, but with spells on the front. And we're almost done with the timeline because the final dual colors, at least for now, are in Duskmourn House of Horror. Duskmourn has a couple of dual colors. First off is a set of all 10 colors called the Unluckies. These are essentially just check lands, but they check for a player's life total instead of, like, basics. So they come in tapped unless at least one player is at 13 or less life. And then finally we get to the allied colored verges. These are also check lands, but in a bit more of a typical check land sense, but still not quite the typical check land, in that they check for basic land types, but unlike the other check lands, they only need to check when they're producing their second color. So the verges just come in untapped and can always tap for their one base color, but then if you control the corresponding basic land types, either of them, they can tap for their second color. The next set, Aether Drift, which has yet to come out at the time of this video, but is only like a few days from launch, is adding the enemy-colored verges. And these are just, verges, but enemy. Although, interestingly, because of the way the verges have like a primary and secondary color, as opposed to like everything else which just has 2 equal colors, that means you could potentially make reverse-colored verges. So even though the combos would still be the allied and enemy colors, you could have like red-green or green-red. So when it comes in, it can make that one base color, but then with the extra secondary color, you could just flip those too. Only time will tell if we'll get reverse-colored verges, but it certainly would be pretty cool. And now it's time for a little bit of trivia. So first off, although originally intended to be in alpha, the commissioned art for Volcanic Island had birds in the foreground, and thus it was decided that the birds were like too prominent, so the art was used for a different, unplanned card called Birds of Paradise, and new art was commissioned for Volcanic Island, but it wasn't completed on time, which means that Volcanic Island just didn't get printed in alpha. So Volcanic Island was first introduced in beta, even though, like at the beginning of this video, I said all 10 were from alpha. Technically, it should have been, but it wasn't. And although not land trivia, the Birds of Paradise card, being a rushed last-minute card, had 2 mistakes on its text. A misformatted line break resulting in a double forward slash, and the words "of any color" were left off of its mana ability. Both of these were fixed in beta. Another interesting True Duel error was that Plateau got new art in Revised Edition, even though none of the rest of the True Duels got new art. But this was due to the original art file being lost, so rather than just not printed at all, like Volcanic Island didn't get printed, they just gave it new art, but they did it on time this time. Visions, not Ravnica, actually printed the first bounce lands that could possibly be considered dual colors, depending on generous you want to be. But the bounce lands in Visions, commonly distinguished as the Karoo lands, bounce their corresponding basics, not just any land, and produce a colorless and a colored mana. So if you want to count colorless as a color, then these are dual color, but it's a little bit of a stretch, so they're here in the trivia instead of on the main timeline. Although not technically a dual-colored land, Riftstone Portal turns your lands into dual colors, specifically Selesnya-colored, while it's in your graveyard. Also, graveyard-relevant cards printed in the Odyssey block had the little tombstone symbol in their upper left corner, but the symbol was scrapped soon after due to not fitting the new frames coming in 8th edition, making Riftstone Portal the only land ever printed with the tombstone symbol. And finally, Zendikar Rising has some lands that are kind of dual colors, but also not. They're called the Pathways, and they're double-sided cards, which you can choose which side you want when you play them, but you can't, flip them. So the two sides are different monocolored lands, and you have the choice of which color, but since you can't flip them, they lock into one color, and they're not really dual colors in that normal sense of there's usually the choice. Like, you still kind of make a choice, but only once. And the rest of the pathways were printed in Kaldheim, so there is all 10 colors, even though originally there was only the 6 pathways. And that about wraps up everything on dual-colored lands. If you've made it this far in the video, please drop a like for turn, and subscribe for more land-filled content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, go ahead and tell me in the comments, and I'll see you next time in Legacy Logbook with Tri-Colored Lands.